Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Marsh. I am a second year audiology student and a member of National NISLA's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Action Working Group. We interviewed Karina Saechao, who is a speech pathologist, speech language pathologist, and studies linguistics and child psychology. For this interview, we discussed how the cultural aspects of language impact children in the Black community who use AAC. We hope you enjoy this as much as we did and maybe even learn something. All right. Thank you for being here and for this interview.
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for thinking of me and inviting me.
All right. So I'm just going to hop right into the questions we have for you, and I'm really excited to hear your responses.
Yay.
So the very first one, um, given that you work as a specialty with AAC, but you're also very passionate about the Black community, of course. How do you see the cultural aspects of language impacting communication for children in the Black community, especially in the context of AAC?
Yeah, that's such a good question, especially to get us started. Language and culture are really intertwined, right? So like they connect people to their communities, heritage, it connects people to each other. And when AAC systems and practices do not reflect a person's language and likeness, we are inadvertently diminishing and denying access to and participation in their culture. So, just so we're on the same page around AAC, I feel like there are lots of different ideas and ideologies about what AAC is. And so I want to do a quick definition of that so that we're all on the same page. So AAC includes no, light, mid, and high tech forms. And no tech forms are unaided and include just your body. So, for example, like gestures, actions, eye gaze, signs, not to be confused with American Sign Language, which is an entire robust language system. But I bring this up particularly because when we talk about AAC, people's mind goes typically directly to high tech AAC systems, which are speech generating devices. These are apps, usually on tablets. But there's also, like I said, no tech, and then there's light tech and mid tech. Light tech being pictures and icons, communication books, communication boards, and mid tech examples are essentially systems that use batteries. They're battery operated, so like single switch communication buttons, different things like that. So now that we've all talked about on the same page around AAC, I bring this up because pragmatics are really a huge part of African American English and Black culture, and Black folks can have whole conversations without ever saying a word. And this is true for folks across the entire Black diaspora, including disabled individuals who are non speaking or minimally speaking and use AAC. And so, really, the impact to like vocabulary, voice, grammar system options, and time in terms of how much time is spent like programming a device and to make it really reflective of the culture is one of the things that we also consider in terms of the cultural impacts for Black children who use AAC. And so there's a question that we have, I think, a little bit later that we'll talk about some more, where I'll be able to explain that a little bit more. But one of the things that I always say is that children deserve to sound like their families and their communities. And so when I think about that and when I say that, I think about like AAC companies, for example, did not begin to capture these like really important distinctions around like skin tone, around voice, and those kinds of aspects of likeness in AAC systems until like 2020 and post 2020. So I started my career as a speech language pathologist about 10 years ago, working in the American public school system. And now I'm in private practice, but it was only 3 years ago. I've been an AAC specialist for about 7, 8 years now. And it's only just recently in the last few years that I have a voice and use a voice that's representative of my own, which means that that's true for Black people who are also in my community or not, like just Black people across the diaspora. And so anyway, lastly, there like I had so many thoughts about this question. Lastly, like while there are different languages that are increasingly represented inside of AAC systems, like there's like Spanish, there's lots of Indo-European languages, so that's something to consider, like French, German. Now there's more languages like Arabic, which is really amazing. There's Chinese is represented. But one of the things that's not represented is like American dialects, like African American English, Appalachian English, like those don't exist already at a foundational level inside of AAC systems. And that includes their lexicons. And so that's something for us to also consider too. So, like going back to the original question, when we're really thinking about like the importance of the cultural aspects of language that impact communication for children, for Black children in community, like all of these things, like there's so much to consider when we're thinking about Black children, when we're thinking about African American English, and then we're thinking about their representation and use of AAC in order to reduce device abandonment.
That was a lot, but it was a great amount of a lot. And yeah, dialects are far, far too often neglected in any kind of linguistic studies, especially when you look at people with disabilities. So that's why when we first started talking about doing this, that was definitely something that when I learned that this is what you do, it was very interesting to me. Um, so then, in your experience, how important is it to consider a child's cultural background when selecting and implementing AAC devices? And could you share any specific examples?
Yeah, very. It's like, I mean, it's very important, particularly because so AAC services should be, I say, like person-centered and family-centered. If that's not the case, we're just not doing it right, right? AAC systems, no matter what the system is, no tech, light tech, mid tech, high tech, multimodal systems, using them all together, right? Like those AAC systems are an extension of the person who is using them. Sometimes I tell educators and families to see them as an additional body part, right? Because they need them to be able to communicate flexibly in the ways that they want to communicate to who, where, how, all of those things to meet their needs. And so, this really means that AAC users and their families are involved in each step of the way in the process of assessment and then later therapeutic intervention through observations, through ethnographic interviewing, questionnaires, other tools and strategies, and really ensuring that like AAC users are feature matched appropriately is also super essential in making sure that they can access their device how they want to access it. So this means, in addition to all of the other features, that we're really also focusing on them having access to the language of their home and their community, like having a voice that's representative of who they are, having lexicon words that are representative of the kinds of foods that they eat in their home, and particularly what they call those foods in their home, right? Skin tone, that they have skin tone that matches like themselves, their family members, their friends, and then even opportunities for like grammar, cultural staples, like anything like that. When we think about like robustness in AAC systems and like putting together these kinds of AAC systems, all of those things are important in addition to all of the other things that we assess for, right? So like no gatekeeping here, consultation and coaching should also be recommended as a part of service to support families, educational teams, communities, really with being able to build capacity to support AAC users. One of the things that we should also keep in mind is that there are many current practices with language and AAC users. The onus is often on the AAC user to enter into the language and communication world of their communication partner. And it does not always support nor emphasize multimodal translanguaging practices, essentially. And so when we think about this, like just really quickly, I won't go deep into translanguaging today, but really it's a theory and a practice, right? That we really, so far in our profession and like educational professions, people often think about people who speak multiple languages, multiple dialects, etc. They think of them as having like two autonomous systems, and then those two systems come together, and then they make a choice about which system they're going to use when, where, where, why, how, all of those kinds of things. But instead, in translanguaging, it's really that they are pulling from their entire linguistic repertoire, that these things are together. They're not necessarily autonomous, right? But your entire linguistic repertoire is used to make meaning, like of language and communication, and that we pull from all of those to be able to be just general languagers, right? Including in multimodal communication and AAC users. And so, we really have to consider, like, what do we think about, or how do we support people who use AAC like as their primary communication form? And sorry, getting back to your question, when we think about like the child's cultural background and implementing AAC devices, like ultimately it's really important, right? AAC users are multimodal languagers. They use a variety of modalities to be able to get their communication needs met. And really, as a practitioner, I see non-speaking students and mentally speaking students who sometimes will like bid for communication without reciprocation, because their communication partner doesn't know or is always aware of like how they're communicating or what they're doing. And so we have to really think about like, what does that mean culturally for them? The only way we can know that is if we're partnering with their families, we're partnering with members of their community, we're learning more about like who they are, who they want to be, how they use language. Families put together ways, they come up with ways that they use language in their homes to be able to understand like the requests that they're making, the comments they're making, the things that they want to do far before they sometimes ever see a speech language pathologist, right? And so when we think about like considerations for culture and cultural background, we have to keep in mind that families are too the experts on their children and how they want to use and incorporate language in their homes. And so AAC can help, but it doesn't always, directly mean that they have to use one kind of AAC system that has been prescribed by us as AAC specialists. So, anyway, lastly, for this question, the consequences of not considering and centering culture are device abandonment at
Mhm.
best, right? And then really like ongoing feelings of being unseen, unheard, misunderstood, and underestimated at worst, right? So like not including their culture and not centering it, forget just including it, right? Like not centering the client or student's culture in representation and customization of their AAC systems means really like not including or thinking about them, so you can't, those are linked. Like you can't unlink them.
So like to me, it just makes sense. We're in this profession to help people, right? Where whether it's speech language pathology or audiology, our whole goal is to help others. And so the fact that looking at these people as like patient-centered care being the key word there, patient-centered, and looking at all of the aspects of them and how we can best serve them, to me makes a lot of sense. But it is important to definitely bring this stuff up. Um, Something while you were speaking that made me like popped into my head was I recently heard a story of a parent talking about how her daughter went through speech therapy, and they kept saying, she's not really picking up on the word couch. Well, we don't say the word couch, we say the word sofa.
Mm.
And it's such a simple thing, but and this was actually like 20 plus years ago that this occurred, but I'm not saying it doesn't happen anymore because it probably does. Like it's such a simple thing that like dialect probably not the right word, but like when it comes to dialects or just home language and the way we speak with the people closest to us may not match what a practitioner is expecting. So the consultation piece really needs to be highlighted. So that
Yeah.
it's even more so in AAC.
Yeah, that is absolutely a relevant example of sometimes some of the difficulties with AAC implementation, quite frankly, with testing bias, right? This expectation that children should use the kinds of words that we expect them to use as opposed to the kinds of words that they have available to them, right? And in the modality that they can produce that thing, so when we're
Mm-hmm.
about AAC users and dynamic assessment and language samples and things like that, like it's really important to keep the kind of example that you just gave us in mind, because do we count them wrong for saying sofa versus couch? I mean, come on, you know what I mean? Or even, like chair for that matter, it's somewhere that you sit, right? So we have to really consider, like the semantics and like widen our scope and our understanding of how we support like AAC users and their families. If they say sofa, then sure, but I have friends who have multiple languages are spoken in their house. And so, for example, instead of calling house slippers or house shoes, instead of calling them that, like they might call them chinelas, like they do in my husband's family, right? So nobody calls them like house shoes or house slippers, right? In my husband's family, would he be marked wrong for saying chinelas at school? Probably, and that's unfortunate, So when I think about like cultural considerations, having those kinds of conversations with family, like really thinking about like ethnographic interviewing questions and procedures, really helps us to get to the bottom of those kinds of questions that could come about.
Yeah, can't agree more. So then moving into that, how do you address these variations of or in African American English when working with children, particularly who use AAC devices?
Yeah, historic research really has often focused on the features of African American English. And by features, I mean, like variable use, for example, or optional use of the copula. So in African American English, you can say she happy, for example, right? So we have lots of really great research and information around what can be expected in terms of African American English grammar, So that's what I mean by features. So while those are an important part of understanding what AAE is and what AAE is not, the features alone do not define all of AAE in practice. And so really, I want to encourage AAE speakers to use their language. Like that's what I do when I'm working with AAE users and their families. And while AAE does not have an orthography, like a written system, an agreed upon written system, that's the beauty of it, right? Like that's the beauty of African American English, So for example, if I'm saying something like "ooh child," like I spell it CHIL apostrophe. One of my friends spells it CHIL, and one of my other friends spells it CHILE, right? But the idea
Mm-hmm.
is the same. We all know that we're saying essentially the same thing. AAE is really a forgiving, creative, efficient, and flexible language, and it's used with like regional, neighborhood, and person-to-person variation, just like other dialects of English, right? So in general, I discourage the restriction of communication practices in favor of aligning with mainstream American English. Like, please don't do that, But I also support and encourage the use of vocabulary that is specific to the community when needed, right? So like grammar practices, vocabulary practices, and overall, really, I encourage speech therapists to let children language, like let them do what they do. We don't really even, especially when it comes to AAC users, like we shouldn't put them in a box. Like AAC users even have their own language, right? Like let's just take it a step further. What languaging looks like and what communication looks like among people who use AAC as their primary communication form is even different than what we can think about for like African American English alone, mainstream American English alone, Appalachian English alone, right? Like we have to allow AAC users to use their entire linguistic repertoire to get their point across, right? To like write the paper, to make the comment, to make the suggestion, to gossip with their friends. Like it is not our job to restrict their communication and how they use it. Instead, it's our job to support and put systems in place and practices in place, and capacity building practices in place to make sure that they can communicate how they want to communicate, what, where, when, why, and how they want to communicate it to all of the people who are also in their community. But then in addition to that, it is our job to also focus on the community. This includes, like all the communities of people that we work with, right? That the people in their community, their educators, their neighbors, their friends, their family members are also doing the work of communicating with them too. It's not just on the AAC user to make sure that they're being understood. It's also on the communication partners who are working with them, talking with them, loving on them, being with them, to also make sure that they're doing their job to make sure that they're being understood themselves and that they're doing some of the work of understanding too.
That obviously, you know me, the first thing that comes to mind is the deaf community. Oftentimes, especially at holidays, the weight of communication falls on the deaf individual. And so I'm sure it is the exact same stress, maybe even a little bit more difficult because AACs are, from what I've seen, very misunderstood sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think I was reading more recently about, I think is it dinner table syndrome? I
Dinner
think it's
table syndrome. Hmm.
yeah, yeah. And there's some parallels there, right? With like generally the idea, is like feeling left out of the overall conversation, like when it's taking place because there's not like a mutual language, to be able to like say the things that they want to say. So sometimes like I think like the hearing family members are not always signing as they're eating and talking. And then the family member who is deaf, like signing is their primary way to communicate. And so they're not always able to engage in communication. Similarly with AAC, like AAC users, especially during meal times, like sometimes people are like, oh, it's too messy. We're eating soup today. Take the AAC away. Like, what? Like, there's so many ways we have to think about. And when they say take the AAC away, right, they're often thinking about like speech generating devices. I'm like, okay, sure, we don't need to have, the speech generating device on the table where, soup can be spilled on it. But what are we going to do instead, right? Like we can put into place some no tech, light tech, mid tech ways to communicate. We can make sure that we are providing aided language stimulation, modeling without expectation to make sure that they still have access to language and that language is being built while they're at the table, or whatever it is that they're doing. And so, I mean, those are all such important points.
Oh man, sorry, I could talk about this all day.
Yeah.
Let's keep moving though. What barriers do you believe exist for Black families in accessing AAC and assistive technology services? And how can we, particularly those of us coming into the CSD field, work to overcome these challenges?
You want the long version or the short version?
uh,
For your seatbelt, girl. I will try to be both brief and comprehensive, okay? Because I love this topic for a lot of reasons. Like there is so much work for all of us to do in this area. And so when I think about barriers can be present at the individual, institutional, structural level, right? And in addition to that, there's a growing body of research and literature that really suggests that barriers to effective clinical educational services are exacerbated for Black children and other children of color, right? In general. So when we think about this, even in relationship to AAC and Black AAC users, there is a lot to consider. So I'll start very briefly with Buchelman and Miranda. I think it was 2013. They talked about the participation model, right? So I think this is the second iteration of the participation model. And in general, they delineate two main barriers for successful implementation of AAC to all AAC users. These are opportunity barriers and access barriers. These are barriers that all AAC users might come across in their lives as AAC users. These are practice barriers, knowledge barriers, attitude barriers about AAC, skill barriers, policy barriers, all of those kinds of things, right? So sometimes the energy is kind of like, oh well, we don't purchase high-tech AAC systems, speech generating devices for 3-year-olds because we never have. You know what I mean? Like we've always done it this way, so we're not going to start now, right? They only use picture communication cards, like things like that, right? Like that's a barrier. High turnover in staff, that's a barrier, right? So all of these kinds of things are barriers. The thing to also consider and keep in mind, though, is that Black children, other children of color, children who speak languages other than English also have barriers that go like far beyond these opportunity and access barriers, right? And so there are more pervasive barriers like bias, right? So when we think about like access barriers, medical racism, bias in medical care and education are also things that Black AAC users and their families will come up against, right? So parents often report delays in getting a diagnosis of a developmental disability for their children. Black children in particular I think they're diagnosed 1.6 years later than their white counterparts, as a person who is autistic, right? All of those are considerations. Diagnoses allow children to have access to services sooner, right? And so if you don't have a diagnosis, then it's really difficult for you to be able to participate in these kind of early intervention services, these very critical early intervention services, right? And so, like, those are some of the things for us to keep in mind, right? And that also kind of covers medical racism. In addition to that, there's lots of educational inequity. So, one of the things that I have talked about historically is like a service apartheid. So when we think about educational inequity, and the reason that I don't call it a service desert is because a service desert does not quite describe, to me what is happening, because deserts are natural landscapes, right? So we think of deserts as being dry, but deserts are natural.
Mhm.
And apartheid, creation of apartheids is not natural, right? And so they're created. When we think about this, we're thinking about really service apartheid more accurately describes what is happening in majority Black communities, because people, systems, organizations are making a choice not to go, for example, into like specific homes, neighborhoods, zip codes. And these feelings and these practices are often perpetuated by people in organizations who were sent to serve them, right? So, like, a service apartheid really more accurately explains like the discriminatory, racist, oppressive systems that create inequality and like inequity in service delivery by generally like denying them access to services, and systematically divesting by like not increasing the amount of Black and African American clinicians, by not problem solving ways to bring clinicians into the neighborhood, quite frankly, by discouraging clinicians to go into specific neighborhoods and zip codes. And so when we think about this, like, Black parents really, they report in general having access to fewer services for their children with developmental disabilities, also because they have fewer service providers who are willing to go into their neighborhoods and serve them. So overall, like, children don't have access to like the tools and services. They don't always have access to qualified professionals because of how schools are funded. And so when we think about how schools are funded, like, they're funded through the local taxes. They're funded, sometimes even the PTAs will, like, having a PTA that has people who are also involved in it, right? And wanting to hold fundraisers, you know what I mean? Like, if your taxes are not able to support having like smart boards, having even just like the bare minimum materials, like a paper and lamination to be able to like print out icons. Like, I've been in cities and been in school districts where it's like not uncommon to go, like, in one day for me to go to a school where everybody has an AAC system, like, everybody has smart boards, everybody has all the materials that they need. And I'm there for, a variety of other reasons, right? And then I could go in the same day to another school in another district, and they barely have textbooks and seats, like chairs, for the kids to sit in. Like, they're, and at an institutional level, like at a systems level, like, they don't provide high-tech AAC systems because they don't have the funding to be able to do it, And so when we like think about all these things, I asked you for the long version or the short version, because trust me, I could have said a lot more things, but there's so much work, like, for us to do when we're talking about like systemic inequities, like for Black children. It is not uncommon at all for me to walk into a classroom and the only kids who don't have speech generating devices are Black children and children who don't speak English as their first language, right? And that is a problem. We have to ask ourselves, why not?
Mhm.
And so, anyway, what we
I'm
can
just
do.
gonna write down because I really want to know. We're gonna talk about this more later, because I personally want to know, but I don't want to take up too much time. Oh my goodness, it breaks my heart because there's there's a reason, but like, what was the reason? Like, and we know the reason was oppression and systematic racism and a multitude of things that go along with that. So it breaks my heart.
Yeah, especially because those policies are pervasive, right? Like, technically, redlining doesn't still exist, right? Like, there are all of these, like, there are all of these historic and institutional policies that are still pervasive, like in our society today, and that still negatively impact many of the children and many of us SLPs, serve, right? Like
Hmm.
I was just supporting a clinician around getting an AAC system, particularly because this student had an intellectual disability because there's lead in their water in their home, right? Like, so when we think about like, environmental racist practices and environmental racism, like all of those things are at play because they create disability, and so it's really, we have a ways to go in terms of how a profession, in terms of how we support the children that we work with, learning about, the systems that we can use to support them, fund their AAC systems, all of those kinds of things. But the practices, that got us here, like also have not been eliminated, so we have to do what we can, like as clinicians, right, to be able to support people. And the way that we do that is through community, like making sure that our practices serve and support not just the client, but also the community that they're with, and do the things that we can do, like at the local level. And then, of course, do the work that we do, if that's where you're at, like outside of that, to increase equity for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like we've kind of already talked about this, but we'll just go through the question completely. How do you involve families in the decision-making process regarding AAC? And what strategies do you use to ensure that their cultural perspectives are respected and integrated?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I'm glad we're still going to talk about it because I have a few more things for that one. Really, family involvement begins during the assessment process, right? So we can do this through ethnographic interviewing. And so ethnographic interviewing allows us to have a more fluid conversation about the family's life experiences, their expectations, and then we incorporate that information into the assessment and then ultimately into the customization of the AAC systems, right? In addition to that, I use environmental or otherwise called the ecological inventories. And so these aim to help personalize vocabulary. It can be used to document how a person participates in and observes various activities in different environments. And so the AAC team can observe and they document just like vocabulary words that are being used, for example, by peers, by individuals in the family or community, things that are happening at home. And of course, they can enlist the family members, the parents, the siblings, the caregivers, whoever's, to be able to also help with these things to guide like vocabulary selection and customization, which you're going to prioritize and things like that. You can also use, and I also use like an activity participation inventory. I like the Practical AAC blog. It's really good. It's like full of materials and resources. So I would like send people there. Bilingual AAC is also really good for all of those kinds of things. And so the activity participation inventory really looks into like different participation patterns, met needs by observing like really critical activities during the day that the AAC user engages in everyday life, at home, at school, at work, in the community, just like wherever they are and what they're doing. Overall, I would encourage clinicians, speech therapists, to use assessment tools and strategies that are affirming across all areas, right? Like neuro-affirming, culturally affirming, right? All of those kinds of things, and focus on what they're doing, right? What they want to be working toward being able to do, and to steer as much as possible away from like deficit assessments, like standardized assessments, all of those kinds of things. Really, we want to know like, what are they doing now? What do they want to be doing that they're not able to do? Like how can we support them, like empowering their communication practices. I overall use like dynamic assessment practices. I use questionnaires. I really get in with I'm a pediatric SLP, right? So that's why I keep talking about kids and students, but I really get in with the students and the families, really to just like, that's the way to decrease device abandonment overall.
Again, I we could sit and talk all day.
Yeah.
This is the hard part of this part of working with NISLAs because I love what we talk about. So it also helps that we have a lot of shared mindsets on things. Um, so we do know that less than 4% of SLPs are Black. How does representation in the field of speech language pathology influence the experiences of the Black children and their families that are seeking services?
Well, it goes without saying that representation matters. And we need more people from diverse communities, including across the Black diaspora, right? Like, even overall, less than 10% of SLPs are people of color at all. And I want to like just take it there real quick in that medical mistrust also extends to the field of speech language pathology, right? Like, we are also implicated as a field in medical mistrust. There is also a deep misunderstanding of Black language, community, and people, like among education and medical institutions, which systematically causes harm to people in the Black community, right? Like, when I have these kinds of conversations with educators, with medical professionals, like, this is one of the things that I hear most often and sometimes projected onto me, right? So people hear that I'm a speech language pathologist and they assume that I have ideologies around language that align with having a standard. I don't believe in having a standard or standard American English. I absolutely believe that everybody speaks a dialect of English and that mainstream American English itself is also a dialect of English, right? And so really, as we kind of touched on a little bit earlier, Black children and their families are more likely to be denied services than their white counterparts overall, including, like having to wait much longer to receive an accurate diagnosis or diagnosis at all. And they are often not believed in general, so like including in speech language pathology around the things that they do at home, for example, versus the things that we sometimes observe at school, like in parents reporting that sometimes their kid says things or does things at home, but then they're not believed because it's never been observed at school, right? And there's like lots of nuances to those things, but there's so much consideration. And Black patients really and like Black clients, they tend to have the best outcomes overall when they are serviced by Black professionals, right? So we know that to be true, not just in speech therapy, but across like medical professionals, across education, having educational outcomes, but less than 4% of SLPs are Black. So they can't serve every Black child, that is in need. And so we have to think about like, well, then what do we do about it? So when I think about the like, what do we do about it? Of course, I suggest like cultural humility, right? And really like it allows for clinicians to support families by being accountable in their learning and practice, right? So different people need different things from service providers like ourselves. And as speech therapists and service providers, the balance of power is tipped in our favor,
Mhm.
really to support students and clients in the ways that they want and need to be supported. So as speech therapists, we can work to like rebalance really some of that power through our interactions. And this looks like including them in the assessment and therapeutic processes and customization of their AAC systems, listening to and noting their primary concerns, putting the expert model aside around assigning them what's best for their child or their family that sometimes is counter to what the family is saying that they need or they want, and really making sure that we provide families with all of their options. Like sometimes, we conduct these assessments like as a profession, and then we say, well, you have to do this. This is your only option. Well, that's usually not true, right? And so it is our job to make sure that we're providing families and clients with all of their options. So overall, cultural humility, it really centers like reflective practices as a lifelong process. We have to really think about what we consider our role is in supporting clients and students and their families when they have different life experiences than ourselves. And so I think that we should keep our therapeutic network wide is what I say. So one of the things that we can also do to support is if we're not a good fit for a family, like if we don't believe that we can serve them best for any reason, right? Like it's not quite our scope of practice, like they have family practices that we're like not always, that we don't always love, or you're not interested in doing this thing but you want to do this thing, whatever it is, that you should be able to refer out to somebody who might just be a better cultural match, who might be a better, match in terms of scope of practice. Like all of those things are also up for consideration when we have like these kinds of conversations.
I love that you said cultural humility. That's something that I learned actually in my grad school program as compared to cultural competence. You know, as someone who is not in a specific culture, there's no way I can become competent in that culture. Cultural humility is, recognizing that I can't be, but still doing the work to learn as much as I can to best serve them. And also being humbled enough that if I can't be the one to serve them best, allowing them to go see someone who serves them better. And
Yeah.
that means so much. So I'm so glad you brought up that aspect of cultural humility.
Right. I mean, and honestly, while we're talking about it, like culture just, it doesn't just allude to like race or ethnicity, right? Like culture includes everything, right? College culture, like educational culture, like where you live is also a part of your culture and makes up who you are, right? So all of those things, like people can often find overlap, in the people that they're working with or serving. If you find yourself being critical, of a family's practices, like that's something for you to think about when we think about cultural humility. If a family can't always make it to the time slot that has been assigned to them for their services, right? Like sometimes I hear some like blaming or accusatory type language from practitioners around whether these people care about their children having services. Like we have to really think about, like we're not the most important people to exist in their lives. Oftentimes, the kids that we work with have multiple service providers. They see lots of people, and there's many things to do. It's our job to really be understanding, to be flexible. Like I get that we also have to make a living, right? Like all those kinds of things. So we have to think about like how do our practices, how do our systems, support families and being able to get their child's needs met, but then you're also as a clinician, getting your needs met too.
Absolutely. So as we come to the end of the preset questions, what changes would you like to see in the field of communication sciences and disorders to better serve Black children and their families, whether we're talking about AAC or just in general?
Yeah, I want to see an increase of the recruitment, admission, retention, and graduation of Black SLPs from across the diaspora in the profession. We
And
need more people.
audiologists.
And audiologists, speech therapists, audiologists, right? Like both. We need more people of color in the profession, period. Right? Like that's the start of what I want to see, right? And overall, like it feels like the question is also kind of asking about like the policies and practices can be changed at a national level. And while those conversations are needed, I believe fully that change begins and really happens at a local level, right? Like if you're going to be a conduit of change and actually enact change, usually you can do it at the local level, right? Starting at your school, then at your district, then at your region, your SELPA, right? Like all of those kinds of things, your special education local plan area, right? So the local SLP knows better than anyone else what their school, clinic, hospital, home-based clients need, right? So with that being said, I often observe very similar experiences across like schools, districts, cities, regions, and states, where there are some things that we do have in common that just overall should be better. So I already have talked about referring out, more collaborations and collaborative conversations about AAC and implementation support are also in order. I also, having a bigger focus on reducing ableism by moving away from the medical model of disability and more toward a social model of disability is also in order. I recognize the implications of these things, right? That the medical model means, that we can assign these diagnoses, then we can, use the ICD-10 codes to be able to say what's going on, all of those kinds of things, right? But overall, in terms of theories, moving toward a social model of disability allows people to really exist, right? To be seen, heard, valued, respected, right? Like I just saw a quote a little bit earlier about, disability being more of an experience, right? And that experience is one of really feeling included, so we have to, when we think about like how we view overall supporting, being able to support children and being able to serve like Black children and their families in terms of AAC, that's something for us to consider. I do want to say, since I have the mic, that I really wish that there was a better understanding of language and linguistics overall. Linguistics is often not a required course at most universities and was not required at my university where I earned my BA or my master's degree. And I bring this up because when I see some of the most harm happening to African American English speakers and AAC users, usually the foundation of that harm is caused through a misunderstanding of language use, language perception, right? And people often tend toward wanting to correct language, right? Like wanting to correct how they use language. This silences their voices, right? Like if we're in the business of empowering children and how they communicate and how they use language, it's our job to make sure that they know that they can language, right? And so I really kind of add that in, because I think it's, what when I started learning about African American English and language disorders when I was in school for the first time around, BA, MA, they talked about like a dialect versus disorder framework, right? Like, oh, they don't speak African, or they don't have a disorder because they speak African American English, right? And so like how we got there, I have no idea, right? Like the idea until recently, which was by Kiyomi Gregory, like the idea that it's one or the other, and not that a Black child who might only speak African American English, because that happens too. There are monolectal AAE speakers, period, right? Like not every Black person code switches, right? But this idea that they could also not struggle with language, and that we have been using that as a way to gatekeep or bar opportunities to receive more support in school, right? Like an overall misdiagnosis of Black children who speak African American English because there's not enough understanding of how to assess them. And so it means that they actually don't get services. And then, of course, on the other end of that, that Black children who don't need extra support because they speak African American English are put into the special education system, right? Like both things are a problem, And so when I think about like what are the things that we need, what are the things that we can kind of work on, like those are the things that immediately come to my mind. So thanks for listening to my rant. Going off on a tangent. I would like to see those things change. I do really believe that taking classes in linguistics, even if it's just introduction to linguistics, to truly have an understanding about the science of language, understanding language, what is language, and not just what are language disorders, right? Like we don't really take a what is language class. We take a what are language disorders, what are the definitions, how do you, like how do you define those things, what can you work on, how do we create language goals? Like that's where we spend a lot of our time. But I really would love to see us as a profession move toward adding in a linguistics class,
Mhm.
introduction to linguistics at the bachelor's or at the master's level, to really better understand this.
And I completely agree. In my first undergrad, we had to take a linguistics class because it was the linguistics of sign language, right?
Mhm.
But it gave that insight. When I went for post-bac, there, like you said, there was no discussion of what is linguistics. There's the discussion of what is a language disorder. So that's very, very important in my opinion as well. I really appreciate you talking about all of this stuff. Do you have any final remarks that you'd like to share with us?
Just a call to action. I want to thank you before I give my call to action. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak today, for thinking about me and the work that I do and all of my passions, Tiffany. I too definitely appreciate it. And so clearly I had time today. So if you all, audience, made it to the end of the talk, like please do reach out to me if you have any questions. I clearly had a lot more to say, but wanted to rope it in for our podcast episode today. But really the call to action is to take steps to reduce bias by learning, unlearning, relearning, using a cultural liaison, conduct culturally responsive AAC assessments that really center the participation approach and family and person-centered approaches, and just do your best. Like this today, of course, I got to talk about some of my gripes with the profession, but I love being a clinician. I love being a speech language pathologist. I love my work with schools, with families, with students, with clients. The work that we do is so important. And I myself am always also unlearning and relearning. And so I am on a cultural humility journey alongside everyone else who has listened to this. And so I do want to encourage you to reach out to me if you feel like you have any questions. But thank you. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for the invite.
Of course. This has been amazing. Thank you so much.